hypostasis of the Archons. It's going to be a movie one day.
Yeah, I mean, that's a book.
That's a book, and it basically means the reality of the rulers, and the rulers are these spiritual forces, these little junior gods, and so it talks about that they're really real and they really exist. Okay, here is the beginning of the story of the creation. As incorruptibility looked down into the regions of the waters, her image, and that's a reference to Piscis Sophia, the feminine divine, appeared in the waters, and the authorities of the darkness became enamored of her. But they could not lay hold of that image, which had appeared to them in the waters, because of their weakness. There's your dualism. Okay, these archons are soulish, and so she's good and they're bad, and the two can't mix. They were from below, while it was from above. This is why, quote, incorruptibility looked down into the regions of the waters, so that by the Father's will she might bring entirety into the union with the light. You listen to that and you have to think about it. What in the world is going on? Well, salvation for Gnosis is the spirit part of a person being rejoined to the true spirit above. That's all that it is. It's the divine spark coming to life and rejoining this region of pure light and spirit above. The rulers, that is the Archons, laid plans and said, "Come, let us create a man that will be soil from the earth." So the creation here is not God creating man, it's the Archons creating man. And they modeled their creature as one holy of the earth, and were off and running into the creation.
Okay, now what's wrong with this?
Here's the really controversial thing about the Gnostics, and this is why the Christians started burning them at the stake, even though arguably Gnosis was the original form of Christianity. Because the Gnostics say that that entity, who the Old Testament calls Yahweh or Jehovah, was the demiurge. They say he's not a real God at all, and has this huge ego, and enchains human beings as his eternal servants, and created entities called Archons, evil angels, to keep mankind in chains. And certain teachers were sent to free us from the control of this demiurge. And you know, it's true. If you look at the behavior of the church, it's very different from anything that Christ says. Nowhere in the words of Christ, anywhere in the gospel, will you find Christ telling us to burn people at the stake, for example. No way. Christ is a beautiful, beautiful figure who brings true knowledge, true gnosis to the world. And he has, in a sense, been hijacked by the money men and the bureaucrats and the power mongers of the church in a misleading process. And Gnosticism, because it saw this clear, was one of the first victims of that fanatical literalist faction in the church that became the Roman Catholic Church, and united with the power of Rome to crush ancient Egypt. The Gnostics were the first to be burnt at the stake in terrible, terrible ways. But we have been taught to believe that in the Garden of Eden the serpent was the bad guy. But for the Gnostics, in the Garden of Eden the serpent was actually the good guy. They say that what the serpent is doing is he's saying to mankind, wake up, remember who you are. You have to have knowledge. You have to know the difference between good and evil. You have to be able to make those choices. You can't remain in darkness. This is what the Gnostics say. So they don't see the serpent as an evil figure at all. They see the serpent as bringing the light of Gnosis to mankind. And pointing out, the serpent does say in that story, after Adam and Eve had eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he said, didn't God tell you that you would die if you did this? Yeah, he did tell us that we would die. And did you die? No. What does that make God? That creature that you call God is not a liar. Profoundly subversive and heretical material. But for that sin of seeking knowledge of good and evil, of fulfilling the potential of our consciousness, for that sin, Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden in a most humiliating and terrifying fashion. And angels were posted at the entrance to the garden with flaming swords to prevent us from ever gaining access to the tree of life. And it's interesting how the book of Genesis says, lest they become gods like us. Who are those us? Later Gnostic sects, because Gnosticism, although driven underground, survived, and it resurfaced in France in a form called Catharism. Gnostic sects had a very strange idea about what the tree of life was. It was a mushroom. And that's actually a recognizable species of visionary mushroom. That is the Amanita muscaria, that is the fly agaric, which is used in shamanistic ceremonies throughout the world. That some kind of eye-opening property in the mushrooms is being considered here. We'll come back to what that might mean. So the Gnostics, just as they turned the Garden of Eden story upside down, they turned the flood story upside down as well. It wasn't to punish evil, as the Old Testament tells us, but to punish humanity for having risen so high and to take the light, the gnosis that was growing amongst men. And the Gnostic texts say the survivors were thrown into great distraction and into a life of toil so that mankind might be occupied with worldly affairs and might not have the opportunity of being devoted to the Holy Spirit. And, throughout history, those who have sought the liberating gnosis, the light, the knowledge of the true nature of things, have been subjected to persecution. And I just want to briefly touch on the tragic story of the Cathars, who lived in what is now southwest France, in the area called the Languedoc, and who undoubtedly were a Gnostic form of Christianity. They held the figure of Christ in the highest order, and for him he was, as I mentioned earlier, the supreme Gnostic teacher. But on the other hand, the Cathars regarded the Pope in Rome as the devil's agent on earth, and they utterly opposed the rule of the popes. And for that, the Gnostics earned the anger of the Roman Catholic Church. Unlike Roman Catholicism of that period, which wanted to keep the populace ignorant and illiterate, the Cathars promoted universal literacy. They believed in the absolute equality of men and women. They were the first paper makers in Europe because they were so keen on literacy. It really was truly a liberating doctrine that was taught in Catharism. And they created a wonderful, free, creative, artistic society. You've heard of the troubadours? They came from the Languedoc. They were originally from the Cathars. But as they flourished and grew, the Church of Rome became more and more angry with them. And finally it sent a crusade against them. That's called the Albigensian Crusades, because Albi was one of the cities in the Languedoc. And this was a terrible, terrible thing that happened back there in France in the 1200s. Terrible things were done to the Cathars. This entire religion, this entire culture, this entire way of life was utterly destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were murdered. Whole cities were razed to the ground. There was burning at the stake at an enormous scale. The books of the Cathars were all destroyed. I mean, just the worst thing that you can possibly imagine took place and happened to them. And by the mid-13th century, they were gone. They were utterly wiped out. And their memory would almost be lost to mankind. So that's what happens when you try to practice this ancient wisdom tradition that took the form of Gnosticism. You are in danger. And from the Gnostic point of view, the Demiurge and his Archons and their human servants, they're always trying to steal the light. And they're certainly trying to do so today. And if the light is growing amongst mankind, as I believe it is, then we can be sure that tremendous archonic forces are at work in the world to suppress it. We shouldn't close our eyes to this. We all want everything to be goodness, but we shouldn't close our eyes to the existence of evil. And we have to be alert, and we have to be strong in order to confront that wickedness.
Gnostic demon is some kind of cannibalistic demiurge that should be thoroughly renounced and rejected.
So I'm going to try to